Welcome back to Philosophy Insights. It's common knowledge that academia leans quite left. In this video, we are looking at some of the details around this fact, and we're going to dive into an explanation by Jordan Peterson and Phil Magness. And we end up, explaining what actually made Marx so prominent. Because surprisingly, he was not prominent during his life. So let's start with an interesting statistic on academia and its political leanings.
The academy has moved to the political far left pretty aggressively. And you see this in faculty surveys. It used to be kind of a plurality on the center left. 45% of faculty lean that way, and then you had smaller sections across the spectrum. Now we're in the 60 to 65% range, and then in disciplines.
How do you define being on the far left?
Yeah, so they using survey data here.
Yeah.
And this goes back to the Carnegie Commission in the early 60s. They poll faculty every couple of years and say, where do you fall on the simple left-right? I think it's a 5-point spectrum. And you see very clear, dramatic growth on the left.
Now, to add to this, interestingly, one does not see a similar growth in left views in the general population. Here, the distribution stays the same. This, of course, raises the question, why academia is leaning so far left? We need to look first at the explanation why Marxist views in general are so attractive. Jordan Peterson is probably better than anyone in giving concise summary on this.
Like often in universities, and I teach a personality course, it's like that's not where you should be learning about the 6 million Ukrainians who died of starvation in the 1930s, but most of my students have never heard of any of that. It's like, what the hell? We fought a whole Cold War about that. We damn near annihilated the planet because of it. And all of a sudden it's an inconvenient for the neo-Marxists to notice that the regimes of Stalin and Mao were brutal beyond comprehension. So how about if we don't talk about it, So there's lots of corruption that's driving this, but a huge part of it is resentment. And I think the worst emotions are resentment, the worst actions are resentment, deceit, and arrogance. And you get those three working together, boy, you got a force that you better be careful with.
There's one explanation why academia specifically leans so far left.
I think it's a deeper phenomenon that comes to the job crunch in academia. And what it's become is political ideology is now a rationing mechanism for a very, very scarce number of jobs in the humanities in particular. We had overproduction of PhDs going back for decades, competing for a tiny number of jobs to just refill on the tenure cycle. And you need a sorting mechanism when you're having 200, 300 people applying for the same position. And if you have a faculty that already leans one way, they're going to choose people who look and think and act the same way that they do.
I have to, I hadn't thought about this in a while, but I was in grad school from 88 to 93 taking classes. And I remember the election of George H.W. Bush, and it might be just because I was there, but that was a flashpoint. Nobody, and I was doing literature and cultural studies, but nobody believed that George H.W. Bush would win because he was so obviously a puppet and not serious and not popular. And Reaganism was this kind of weird phenomenon that, that was a bubble that had popped. And when Dukakis lost resoundingly, actually, to H.W., that was a moment where people kind of lost their shit. And they were, remember people saying, like, I don't feel comfortable in my own country. A lot of the arguments now that left-wing academics talk about, right-wing kind of yokels, that, poor white Christian types are always talking about being a stranger in their own country. Academics were talking about that in the late 80s, and I suspect that might have politicized people deeply.
Yeah.
As a last point, we should look at how Marxist thinking got so influential. Surprisingly, Marxist himself was not as well cited during his life. He comes as a prominence only later. This is what happened.
So the state of Marx right now, he's very much ascendant in intellectual life. And there have been multiple metrics. He is consistently one of the top 2 or 3 most assigned authors in college courses. Nature magazine did an empirical study of Google citation counts, and he comes up at the very top of the list of the most influential scholars. There's philosophers who have declared him the single most significant social scientist of the 20th century. He is ubiquitous across the humanities and social sciences as a presence, with the exception of economics. where he's seen as kind of this antiquated, debunked. But we go back to Marx's life. He is fundamentally writing as an economist. Das Kapital is a critique of political economy. He presents himself as making his major contribution there. So the discipline that he set out to influence rejected him very early on. Part of it is he just happens to be at a moment in time when the labor theory of value is being displaced by subjective or marginal value. And as a result, he falls into obscurity that by the turn of the 20th century, the Economic Journal runs a book review of a new edition of Das Kapital, and the author of it says, "Who should tilt at such a windmill?" Saying Marx is Don Quixote. He's a nobody in our discipline. So I asked the question, how does Marx get from that in, say, circa 1900, a peripheral, obsolete footnote in the history of economic thought, to a little over 100 years later, this giant across multiple disciplines? And I did some investigation looking at Marx's citation counts in academic journals and books, and you find they just kind of piddle along from his death till a very specific event, 1917, and they triple overnight. And then it's just off to the races since there. So what happened in 1917 is the Bolshevik Revolution that proclaims a state built on Marxist principles after Lenin seizes control of a major world power. So the empirical study that I'm doing here is asking the counterfactual. It's myself and Michael McCovey as my co-author. And what we've done is we've collected over 200 authors from the 19th century that were contemporaries of Marx. And you can see where their citation counts matched Marx prior to 1917. And you find that he is not a top-tier thinker. He's not up there with Adam Smith or John Locke or John Stuart Mill or even someone like Herbert Spencer is a giant of that era, now kind of obscure. Marx comes in roughly at the level of Johannes Karl Rodbertus and Ferdinand Lassalle and some of these fairly obscure socialist thinkers by our own time that were his contemporaries.
So, I mean, it kind of makes sense if Lenin, Lenin is the hype man for Marx. And, there's a successful revolution in that the Soviets take over and, and then they have a pretty good run. Why does the end of the Soviet Union not discredit Marx, if anything? And there was a moment, actually, I think, in the 90s where I can remember, again, I was in grad school in literary and cultural studies, and people were like, okay, we got to stop emphasizing Marx. And there was a boomlet in Hayek among left-wingers. They were like, oh, we can learn a lot from Hayek in particular. But Marx is back, baby. He's like Top Gun, right?
That's exactly it.
So what's going on with
the Soviet
that?
Union falls apart, and they find out that all the supposed economic prowess, the stuff that Paul Samuelson had been projecting Soviets would overtake America, it's like painted over rust on old machinery. And I think the fall of the Soviet Union reveals that, along with the atrocities that you start seeing. But there was a weird moment, and I think it happened between the mid-1990s, early 2000s, where people that were of the left, that were ideologically or philosophically inclined to Marxism, dissociated Marx from the Soviet experiment. Even though the Soviet experiment had been the thing that elevated him, they said, oh, well...
He's in all the paintings. He's in all the, it's never,
Exactly. And it's like this open question. They said, well, the Soviet Union is not true socialism. They deviated from Marx. Here's the other way. And I'm sitting here saying, wait a minute, you owe the fact that this guy is even on the intellectual map to the events of 1917 and the Soviet state dumping millions upon millions of dollars worth of resources into promoting him and his intellectual work.
Thank you for watching this video, and if you like the content, subscribe to Philosophy Insights.